Welcome to InfoRights channel. Today we need to go back to employment conditions, and I intentionally use this phrase, employment conditions, and not entire labor law, because posted workers are bound by legislation of a chosen country. Who makes this choice? Well, it's the parties. It's the employer and employee who have the right to choose which legislation in the realm of labor law will be applicable to their contract. But this freedom of choice is limited. It is limited, first of all, by prevention from choosing the law that would deprive the worker the protection given to him by the legislation that otherwise would be or would have been applicable. What it means is that you can choose the legislation of the receiving member state or the legislation of the sending member state, but if you don't make a choice, there is a residual legislation applicable. And which legislation is that? Well, usually it's the legislation of the home country or the country where the employee usually carries out their work. So that's the first restriction. The choice made by the parties may not lead to deprivation of the protection awarded to the worker by the legislation that would have been applicable had the parties not made their choice. Well, let's put it into simpler words. You cannot make a choice of the legislation that is worse or much worse for the worker than the legislation of his own. That's the first limitation. The second limitation, much more important and applicable in every case, is the limitation that stems from the from the Posting of Workers Directive. The directive on the posting of workers says that whichever legislation is chosen by the parties, there is a set of rules that will be applicable from the legislation of the receiving member state. And the purpose of this is to make sure that the employment conditions are not much worse than in the receiving member states, in the legislation of the receiving member states, in order to make sure that the competition between the companies, the local service provider and the posting service provider, are equal. So it levels the field on which the companies play. The strange thing is that if you read Article 3 of the Posting of Workers Directive, you will notice that, like entire directive, this article is not addressed to workers, it is not addressed to employers, it is addressed to the member states. And it says, and let me just read it here, member states, the receiving member states, shall ensure that whatever law is applicable to the employment relationship, whatever legislation the parties have chosen, the undertakings who are posting workers to the territory of that member state will make sure that the terms and conditions of employment listed in this Article 3 of the receiving member states, which are either stemming from the legislation or collective agreements known as generally binding collective agreements, or arbitration awards, which also have been declared as universally binding. So whatever the employment condition is coming from there, it will be applicable according according to the rules of the receiving member state. And there are 9 areas of these employment conditions that have to be obeyed, no matter what legislation is applicable according to the will of the parties. These areas, let me just list them here, are maximum work periods and minimum rest periods, minimum paid annual holidays, the remuneration consisting of all the elements, mandatory elements of the remuneration according to the legislation of the receiving member state, the conditions of hiring out workers, in particular the supply of workers by temporary employment agencies, health, safety and hygiene at work, protective measures with regard to terms and conditions of employment of pregnant women or women who have recently gave birth, or of children and young people. Equality of treatment between men and women and other provisions of non-discrimination. And in 2020 there were 2 more fields where employment conditions are applicable to the posted worker. The first condition is the conditions of accommodation whenever they are provided by the employer. So it's not the provision that determines who pays for the accommodation. This is up to the legislation chosen by the parties. But if in the receiving state there are any provisions related to the number of square meters per worker or the conditions of living of workers, they must be obeyed if the employer provides accommodation. And the second one is that allowances and reimbursement of expenditure to cover travel, board and lodging expenses for workers who are away from home for professional reasons will be also paid according to the legislation of the receiving member state. Now, this last provision, and it is very important, relates only to the business trip which is done on the territory of the receiving member state. So we are not referring to the trip from the home country to the receiving member state and back. But if you have a worker who is posted, let's say, from Spain to France, for this trip you pay according to the legislation that the parties have chosen. Usually it's going to be Spanish legislation. But for the trip within France, if the necessity occurs, you apply the provisions for allowances, lodging and per diems according to the French legislation. Those are the limitations of the free choice of the legislation when it comes to employment conditions. But it's not the end of the story, I'm sorry. There is one more provision, which is even more important. And that's the favorability principle. And it basically says that the application of the employment conditions of the receiving member state may not lead to the situation where more favorable conditions are not applied to the posted worker, more favorable conditions from their home labor law. And that favorability principle is forcing employers who post workers to constant comparison of employment conditions in the receiving and in the sending member state in these 9 areas that I have just mentioned. Thank you.